Requito. Come in, Cebu.
Maayong hapon, Dr. Professor Olivera, Professor Bessie Enriquez, ug sa inyong tanan, gikan sa University of Philippines, Cebu College. Okay. I am Gertrude Requito, Faculty of the University of Visayas, Cebu College. And this is our question. Dr. Olivera, one project which you support is the Marine Biodiversity Biomedical Links Initiative for young Filipino students. What response do you get from the Philippine society for a project like this? And is this project supported by the national government?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that question as well?
I can repeat that. One project which you support is the Marine Biodiversity Biomedical Links Initiative for young Filipino students. What response did you get from the Philippine society for projects like this? Is your project supported by the national government?
Yes. My project, my particular project is at its very early stages, and I'm still making contacts with the appropriate people who will help me with being able to reach primarily second grade and third grade students. So to amplify on this project, what I would like to see is college students at the University of the Philippines who then go out to primary schools and teach the kids to do experiments. Since, as Professor Concepcion mentioned in her introduction, my own interest in science came in the second grade when I did a chemistry experiment. I feel that I was just lucky and that every second grade and third grade student should get to do some experiments. And what I'm trying to do is combine a chemistry experiment with an experiment that also exposes the students to biodiversity. So in answer to your question, I have not yet really dealt with the government because we're still developing our own materials that we want to be effective before we begin interacting with government agencies. However, I feel that the preliminary feelers that we've set out with respect to this project have been very encouraging so far.
Thank you. Now we have UP Los Baños. Go ahead. UP Los Baños, our moderator there is Dr. Evelyn Rodriguez. Come in, Los Baños.
Good afternoon from UP Los Baños. We have a question from Ms. Banuhay Serrano, an instructor in chemistry. How has the development of Prialt and other painkillers from cone snails economically benefited the Philippines? And how do we ensure that the country will economically benefit from its marine biodiversity, which you said is the highest in the world? Thank you.
Yes, that's a good question. So in the case of Prialt, unfortunately, the answer is that we never patented omega-conotoxin M7A. And so since we didn't patent it, we didn't benefit. The University of Utah, where this compound was discovered, didn't benefit. And unfortunately, that also means the Philippines didn't benefit. Ever since then, however, we've been more careful to patent materials. And so some of the compounds I've told you about, such as conantuchins and contulakins, have been patented. And the problem is that it takes many, many years from the time a compound is first discovered and the time that it's shown to have some promising applications to the time that it goes on market. And in the case of Prialt, even if we had patented the drug, it took so long before it was approved that our patent actually would have expired before the drug was commercially distributed. So I think one has to be realistic about drug development. I think it's very easy to say, well, you know, big foreign corporations are cheating us and they're taking advantage of our marine bioresources. But in fact, I think we need to have as many of our potential drug leads developed, no matter how. I like to say to people that 100% of nothing is still nothing, and 1% of $1 billion a year is a lot of money.
Thank you, Dr. Olivera. Now we have UP Baguio online. Our moderator is Dr. Zenaida Botuanan. Come in, Baguio.
Good afternoon from UP Baguio. We have a question here from Mark Chan, a ComSci student from the College of Science.
Sir, my question is, would there be any side effects? Sir, my question is, would there be any side effects from these venom drugs? That's all.
Yes. So the question was, are there any side effects from these potential drugs? And the answer is that it differs in each case. So Prialt, in fact, is not a very easy drug. And the reason is that if it stays within the spinal cord, it's quite a good drug. But the same channel which is important for pain in the spinal cord is also found in the higher centers of the brain. And so if your pain is coming in the part of the spinal cord closest to the brain, the amount of drug that has to be given sometimes causes the drug to enter the brain itself. And under those conditions, there are all kinds of rather complicated side effects. In contrast, Contulakin is a drug that has almost no side effects in animal models of pain. And so for this reason, we think it's very, very promising. So it really depends on the drug. So just because it comes from a venom doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to have more dangerous side effects. But that's a very good question. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Dr. Olivera. Now I think we have a better connection with the Open University. Come in, Open U.
This is the second question from the UP Open University. We have Professor Marisol Hidalgo for the question.
Good afternoon, Dr. Olivera. I would like to ask you something that is not really something that's not really part of the presentation, but I'm curious of why did you decide to ask your first research question, which is what is it in toxins that killed people, when there were so many other questions that you could have asked instead?
That's actually a very, very interesting and good question, and an important scientific question. I think we asked that question because it was a question that we could potentially answer. And I think that it's important to work on questions that you can potentially solve. I think that we could have asked a lot of other questions, but it did not seem like it was feasible for us to be able to answer them given the time and the resources that we had. But the reason we chose that question is because both Professor Cruz and I had a biochemical background. Both of us had experience in purifying materials, and we could get a lot of the venoms of this snail. And so it seemed feasible that this was a question that we could solve. And so I think that one problem is that, of course, there are very interesting questions in science, but you have to be realistic about which questions you can really effectively address. And I think answering the questions that you can effectively address is really an important consideration in what you do.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Olivera. Now we have UP Manila. Manila, come in, please.
Ms. Professor Rosario Robite, from the Department of Biology, and she would like to pose a question to her longtime idol.
Dr. Olivera, I would like you to know first that I am your fan. Since when I was still a BS biology student, I would always choose conotoxin as topic for my seminars, for my reports in physiology, and now as a physiology teacher, I would always tell my students about conotoxin. And now, I emphasize to them also that the person who elucidated on this conotoxin is Filipino. And not only that, a graduate of the University of the Philippines. Ang galing natin, di ba? My question is, for the last 30 years, you have been working on peptides produced by venomous conus snails. This has led to the elucidation of key molecular mechanisms that underlie nervous system function. May we know any update on conantokin peptides, which are being eyed as possible drug cure for insomnia? You mentioned earlier about the possibility of conantokin on epilepsy, but before you also mentioned before on its possibilities on insomnia. Another peptide is sigma conotoxin, which you said also before would have a good potential as antidepressant. Any update on this, sir?
I'm afraid that on those two, not much progress has been made.
Okay.
The limiting thing in pushing things forward with regard to their applications is, is often the availability of appropriate animal models. So where there are a lot of animal models, it becomes much easier to say whether a particular compound has applications. And this is really a field where I think some work could be done within the Philippines. A problem is that animal experimentation is both very complicated and very bureaucratic in the United States today. You can't imagine how much it costs to maintain one mouse in a university setting. But in fact, having an animal model of a disease is critically important in really very quickly saying whether or not a particular compound has potential applications in that disease. And the problem with depression, for example, is that there are no really reliable animal models of depression. They're very complicated models that may or may not really be parallel to the human condition.
Thank you, Dr. Olivera. Now let's go back to Diliman, to the theater. Anybody from the theater who would like to ask a question? Yes, please.
I'm Ben Vallejo, Assistant Professor of Environmental Science. Professor Olivera, like you, I'm working on marine snails of the Oliva genus. Now, you mentioned earlier that biodiversity should be accessible to researchers if there would be indeed progress in our studies here of marine invertebrates, but it has become very hard. There are a lot of restrictions